Welcome to a presentation on the 2022 Public Perception Survey on Plastic Pollution. Virginia's Voters Support Action. This presentation will be presented by Steve Raabe, the president of OpinionWorks.
We're really excited to share with you today the results of a statewide survey of Virginia voters that was done in spring of 2022. The study was done in conjunction with the Virginia Coastal Zone Management Program and Clean Virginia Waterways of Longwood University by working with OpinionWorks. And I'll just tell you a little bit about Steve. So Steve Raabe is the president of OpinionWorks. OpinionWorks is an independent research firm based in Maryland. He founded OpinionWorks in 2001. And I think we've been working with him for at least 7 or so years on various research projects. So OpinionWorks applies science-based research practices with the goal of fostering behavior change and engagement in environmental stewardship and public health and education. He measures the public's priorities and attitudes for state and local agencies. He's done it from Delaware to Oregon, and like I say, quite a bit in Virginia with our marine debris efforts. So he researches the behavioral causes that are often behind these behaviors.
I'm going to share with you this exciting survey of Virginians about issues related to plastics, and most particularly plastics that end up in our environment. So we'll see what people's attitudes are, and following up on what Zach just presented to you, kind of what they're willing to do in terms of public policy and what they'd like to see happen there. And so there's a lot here to talk about. I will invite you as I go to use the chat. I think if anybody has questions, and Katie, Zach, I know you guys will help me kind of keep track of that. I've got my chat window open too. And so let's just kind of use that if things occur to you while I go. And I do want to say a little bit of an apology to people that may have seen this a few weeks ago at the Marine Debris Summit, Virginia Beach. It's going to be similar, but there's some new things to talk about. So hang with me. So I'd like to, for those that don't know my firm or don't know me and we haven't had a chance to work together, I just want to tell you for 1 minute a little bit about our credential and our background. I mean, Katie's right. I founded this firm in 2001 because I wanted to work on issues that were important to me personally, like you all are doing. I mean, I think we want our volunteer life and our mission and our values to line up with how we're investing the best energies of our day. And so I'm bringing the tools of market research that might be applied to industry or things like public health studies and other very well-founded survey research techniques to behavioral questions and attitudinal questions as it relates to all of the issues that you're working on. Let's say marine debris, let's say Chesapeake Bay cleanup, land preservation and other things, reforestation, wetlands restoration and other things, as well as public health concerns. In addition, we're the longtime polling organization for the Baltimore Sun newspaper. I have to say, as these ballots are painfully counted slowly, very slowly, here in Maryland, not certified until this Friday, and they're taking their time counting some of these local races. Our polling is looking good in terms of accuracy, and I'm very proud of that. And so that's something, that same care is something that we brought, of course, to this project. We wanted to be truly reflective of the Commonwealth of Virginia and what the voters think. I also want to just give a little shout out to this particular project. If anybody here is engaged with behavior change work, with public outreach, where you're trying to engage the public through a social science-based approach, if you don't already know about it, please know about this, the Chesapeake Behavior Change website, otherwise known as chesapeakebehaviorchange.org. And that we have helped develop under the auspices of the Chesapeake Bay program and their web team, who built the backbone of this site. And on here, accessible to you is the entire data set across the Bay watershed, of course, including Virginia, which looks at people's behavior and their intention across 19 different actions that advocates hope that they'll take. So it's an interesting thing to know about, but there's also some background resource type material for you in terms of putting together good public outreach campaigns that are based in the best practices of social science. So take a look as you have time. So talking about Virginia and the survey we did here, this is a representative sample. There's 901 interviews in the data set, so it's a good solid sample size. This produces a margin of sampling error of plus or minus 3.3%. It's mixed mode, which means that we don't sample just by phone anymore. And so these days we're blending together online sampling and telephone sampling. And of course, the telephone includes both wireless and landline. And so through these multiple means, we're putting together a blended population sample, which does a very good job of finding people and being representative within all corners of the electorate. And so we're getting more transient and younger people and people of color and people who are high income and low income and so on. And so it does a good job these days, the best job that we can manage these days in terms of sampling. The dates when we were in the field were in March. And then, you know, the added feature is that we picked out 10 people from the survey sample who represented different archetypes that we saw, you know, people with some attitudes that we recognized from the data set. And we wanted to know more about their thinking. And so we invited them into in-depth interviews where one interviewer, one-on-one with them in a Zoom environment, took them through some conversation around some of these issues that we're about to talk about so that we could figure out some of the ways in which people were processing some of the information and thinking about some of the different issues that we're about to discuss. I just want to briefly make the point that it is representative, that it represents a span of ages and race and ethnicity, gender, and also not on this chart, but we have looked at region of Virginia and have broken down the sample into 6 regions. And I will share a little bit of that with you as we go forward in terms of the numbers and how that breaks out regionally across the Commonwealth. But we will also be able to share with people a more detailed data report, which will give breakouts for any of these categories for all the questions on the survey. So let's begin with some context. We want to understand how people are thinking about plastics and those things getting out into the environment. So the first thing we did is we asked people to rate a whole series of problems that you can see here on the screen on a scale of very serious, somewhat serious, not much of a problem, or not a problem at all. And inflation, of course, you know, we've got some non-environmental things in the list, like inflation and like COVID-19 and good paying jobs, severe weather events. Maybe that's an environmental issue. But inflation was number one. 76% of Virginians said this was a very serious problem. Another 20% said it was somewhat serious of a problem. We can all agree with that. It's a very big concern on the minds of people. But just beneath that is plastic floating in the ocean and plastics and toxins contaminating human food. So 87% of Virginians said plastic floating in the ocean was a very serious or a somewhat serious concern to them. Look how it compares to these other concerns that we all have. Climate change is here about in the middle. 73%, 3/4 of Virginians consider it to be a problem, either very or somewhat serious. But it is well below plastics floating in the ocean. So this problem of marine debris, of contaminants getting into the ocean, is something that's on many people's minds, and it's something that we have heard a lot about in focus groups on other topics. So we might be interviewing people about recycling or about air quality or land preservation, and plastics in the ocean comes up. It almost always comes up. It's something that the public is very concerned about. So this was definitely something. I think the magnitude of this, I think Katie from another survey, you had a preview that the numbers might be pretty high like this. I think though, even so, we were a little bit surprised by just how much it resonated with people as a worry. Now, the questions coming into the chat: how do we explain trash and litter in your community as the least prioritized? And how might respondents read that differently than plastic floating in the ocean? So yes, trash and litter in your community is down here, 24% plus 36%. With rounding, it totals up to 61%. So much lower than plastic floating in the ocean. There's a couple of things to say about that. I mean, one is that many people live in communities where they don't see this as a problem, versus most people thinking of the ocean and being concerned about it, either from things they've seen on the beach or things that they have heard about, read about, seen on social media or whatever. So there's certainly that. The other factor that I would point out, though, in all of our anti-littering work that we've done over the years, one of the little phenomena that we've noticed is that people that chronically litter, that litter a lot, that throw stuff when they have it in their hands, when we get them into a interview setting, one of the things that they say when we ask about where they do and don't litter and where litter really bothers them and where it does not is that litter in the water is much more bothersome to people than litter on the land. And part of the reason that people articulate around that is that they understand, even if they're not scientifically minded at all, that there's an ecosystem inside the water and that they are potentially hurting living things that are in the water. And it's different from, this may not seem intuitive to everybody, but it's different from how people think about what goes on up on the land. So there definitely are some differences, and I'm glad you pointed that out. And by the way, there's another methodological question I'll just deal with. Were the choices randomized in the surveys? And yes, where we had lists like this or choices in a list, they were randomized so that we didn't have a biasing effect by listing something first all the time. And this, you're welcome. And so this concern about plastic, if we look across the regions of Virginia, it's pretty consistent. The very serious bar reaches its height in Greater Richmond, but it's frankly not that much higher than it is in Northern Virginia, Southside, or Piedmont and Mountain Virginia, which I, for shorthand, calling West here. In rural Tidewater, the concern is a little less pulsating, but look at all the somewhats. And so it totals together up to 96% in rural Tidewater, which means the areas between Hampton Roads and Northern Virginia and kind of east of the Richmond Metro, as you can imagine, up against the bay, including the Eastern Shore. So, why do people feel this way about floating plastics in the water? Carol, one of our in-depth respondents from Williamsburg, said, "It's very disturbing. I'm concerned about plastic pollution in the water and elsewhere because it affects all the fish and wildlife and people. It's not good, and it's something that we really need to get a handle on because it's gotten to the critical point right now." So again, you see concern for wildlife in the water, but also people. So there's linkages that people are making that I'll talk a little bit more about. And it's gotten to a critical point right now. So there is this sense that the problem is getting worse and that we're at some kind of a tipping point. And I think Carol reflects what other people are saying and asks, do they understand intuitively that what is left on the land makes its way into the waterways? Aha, good question, Ann. We're gonna come right back to that in just a minute. I will bring you back to that in just a couple of minutes. Monique from Roanoke said, "It really kind of makes me sad that people won't take care of the earth and they'll just discard trash, not thinking anything about how it affects the ecosystem that we live in. Makes me wonder, why is this happening? Why hasn't anybody done something to help stop this or reduce this?" Younger person, feeling urgency, really wants action. I mean, part of the takeaway that I hope you will have from this presentation today is that there is a lot of urgency in the public about this issue that we're talking about. And so those of you working on public policy making or advocacy, I hope that you can communicate that, to our elected people, that the public is actually feeling pretty urgent about this. I mean, they're hearing from industry. We all know that. I think the public is frustrated and wants things to happen. So for our NOAA friends and others who use the term marine debris and think about marine debris, of course, we all do. We wanted to test both people's impressions of that and kind of what they want to call it, to see if this is something, the term marine debris is something that sticks. So one of the things we learned is that marine debris is probably, even though you'll see in a minute, most people get what it means when you say marine debris, it's not as descriptive as some other terms that we could potentially use. And so we tested these 6 ideas up against each other. And plastic ocean pollution or plastic pollution rated the strongest. Ocean litter, ocean plastics. Marine debris and marine litter were down towards the bottom of this list. So I'm not asking NOAA to change the name of its program by any stretch, but I am saying to those of us that are in kind of a position of communicating about all this with the public, that maybe there are some other terms that are both a little bit more descriptive and also much more evocative in terms of communicating what we're talking about. When we ask them in an open-ended way to tell us what they think marine debris is, 40% roughly say something about garbage, trash, litter, debris in the water. And then there's plastics specifically, ocean plastic bags, bottles, 11%, and so on. Some people go to an emotional response right away. Some people go to a marine life response right away. Some people want to cast blame, right away. But regardless of whatever their immediate reaction is to the term marine debris, we can see that most people do get it. There's a few people that don't, that are not sure, or say something else that's not on the list, but most people get it. So at the time that we were doing these interviews, there was a study that had come out in the media about the amount of plastic that's in our food. And if I remember correctly, it was a credit card's worth that gets into our food supply in a given week. Do I have that right? I think. And so that was,
yes,
that right?
There's some questions about how accurate that is, but yes, it's approximately a credit card a week that we ingest.
Yeah, and so that had just hit the news waves, I think, when we were doing our study. And so people were thinking about that to some degree, people that had seen it. And then we inform people about plastic in the food supply in the interviews, in the deep interviews, to find out how they would react. So some people were very surprised. That's a big surprise, to be honest. That makes me feel kind of groggy, sick a little bit just to think about it. If you just imagine yourself biting plastic and eating, that doesn't feel right or good at all, says Edgar. Taylor says, I'm going to have to think a lot about what I'm eating now. It's gross. It's sickening to know that. Helen says, I don't want to put that in my body. We are what we eat, and we're all interconnected. What we put into the ocean comes back to us. So I think studies like that, I think messaging around food and the aquatic food supply and the plastic coming back to us as a human health issue is very powerful for people. We certainly saw that here, and I'm sure all of you would agree intuitively to that. But we have a little evidence from this. Here was a surprise for us, and we didn't even really recognize this at the time that the survey was in the field, but we figured it out and decided, Zach actually suggested that we ask about this in the in-depth interviews, and I'm so glad that we did. So we wanted to know if people understood what plastics are typically made from, and then informing them that they're typically made out of petrochemicals. How do they feel about that? So first of all, 0 out of 10 interviewees knew what plastics are made from. And one person kind of had an inkling, but nobody knew, certainly nobody knew that it was from petroleum. So Taylor says, that's intense. I didn't know that. I knew that there were a lot of chemicals that were put into making plastic, but I didn't know that essentially the same thing that we use to drive around is what's in plastic. I mean, Taylor's a sort of mainstream guy. He's kind of a normal, regular guy, likes to go to the gym. He's just kind of a normal guy living life, and confronted with a fact like this is his reaction. And he really was set back on his heels. Jamie said, they come from a non-renewable resource, and those are limited. And so when I think about using plastics and the idea of recycling plastics or reusing plastics, it's not just the purpose of not polluting and littering, but also this idea that it comes from a non-renewable resource. I think that's very interesting. You know, and you think about this spring, that's just when gasoline prices were really spiking. The war in Ukraine was beginning, gas had jumped. People were really thinking about all that and really the limitations on our fuel supply. So combine all of that scarcity motif with people's concerns about, oil and consuming oil and all that stuff we just heard about on the previous slide. And you can see sort of a powerful mix. But I always find it quite interesting in studies like this when an environmental question is being asked and the answer that we hear back from people is not necessarily environmental, but it's something that maybe is a little higher on their hierarchy of needs. And in this case, scarcity, and scarcity of a resource that we're using for other things. And by the way, is very expensive right now. So I think we need to all think creatively about how to employ these arguments, again, when communicating with people and trying to engage. Littering. Let me talk for a couple minutes about littering. So first of all, behavior. We like to ask about two things: tossing and picking it up when you see it. So we try to make it socially desirable or at least neutral, to admit that you might toss stuff sometimes. And we've worked hard on this over the years to kind of come up with a way to do that. And it seems to work okay. We have 12% across Virginia that admitted on the survey that they often or sometimes toss stuff on the ground. Another 12% said they seldom do it, but that means they do it once in a while. So about 1 in 5, almost 1 in 4 are admitting to that kind of a behavior. Do you pick it up when you see it? 20% often, plus 48% sometimes. So we've got about 2/3 of the public. One of the things that anybody who might be engaged in littering behavior or trying to persuade the public not to litter, one of the things that we do ask litterers when we have them is, where do you not litter? When are the times you don't do it? What are the circumstances? And one of the things they talk about is social pressure and kind of the times that they're in places where they can tell that other people are watching, or they're not. This is not a neighborhood where people do litter. It's a neighborhood where people pick up. And that tipping point that occurs in neighborhoods, when it becomes a neighborhood that picks up and cares more about itself versus letting itself be excessively littered, it actually is a tipping point that we can observe. So the idea of engaging the public to pick up rather than just not litter, but to actually engage everybody else in picking it up when you see it, is a very important strategy and something that can help increase pressure on these people, social pressure not to do it. How do you feel when you see litter? You can see a word cloud that has developed here. Type in one word that describes how you feel when you see litter on the ground near where you live: sad, angry, mad, frustrated, etc. So, people are upset by emotions. Here's Taylor again. I've referred to him a couple times. I really like him because he just was kind of this middle of the road guy who didn't have a lot of preconceived positions on things. He was open and kind of was interesting to see how he processed things. And so this is getting back to what Anne said earlier. No, people do not get that the stuff that's floating around in the water ends up in the waterways. And so Taylor's comment is, I didn't know that 80% of the plastic in the ocean comes from inland. And so I think understanding that basically the litter in our community is what makes up the litter in the ocean is a huge game changer. Now read between those lines. Do you think Taylor might be somebody who occasionally tosses something on the ground when he's not near a trash can? Maybe. He's been awakened by this. He was really worried about plastics in his food, as you saw, plastics floating in the water. Very few people out of the 10 had any sense at all that stuff that's kind of flushed off the land is ending up in the water. There was some of that. But by and large, when you ask people how it gets there, they're prone to say, oh, it's either ocean liners that are dumping it, or it's people in fishing boats that are tossing stuff over the side. It's tourists who are on the beach. And we know that those are problems. There's problems with all of those individual things, but that's not the major cause. And so awakening the public to this is helpful. All right, I'm going to shift to bottled water now for a minute. So let's start here. Before we get to bottled water, let's talk about tap water, because of course we want the public to feel better about their tap water if their tap water is something they should feel better about. Not every locality has the excellent tap water, but most do. And yet there's a lot of concern about tap water out there. And a lot of this is driven by news items we've seen beginning with Flint, obviously, and going all the way through. And there have been a lot of things around water supply problems. But even in places where the water is perfectly healthy, where people have very good tap water, there's still lots of worry about it. So clean and healthy, we asked them to grade it on a scale A through F. And 25% give their water an A and 33% a B. So a little under 6 out of 10 give them an A or B. Everybody else is a C or lower or don't know. Taste, which is of course an important issue for all of us. So the numbers are similar, 57% versus 17% D or F, or 40%, C, D or F. And then the pipes leading into your home, which is a concern for some people for sure. 45% A or B. A lot of people don't know about the condition of their pipes leading into their home. There's a lot of concern about that. So what does this translate into? Do people drink their tap water at home? So 37% only of Virginians said that they drink their tap water unfiltered. 47% drink it filtered. If you add these two numbers together, they come up to 84. So some people, they were able to pick more than one thing on this list. So there may be people that drink it both filtered sometimes and unfiltered sometimes, but it nets out to 3/4. 77% of Virginians are drinking out of their tap. Everybody else is not drinking out of their tap, 1/4. And there's a lot of bottled water drinking that is resulting. When you net these two numbers, there's 8% that say that they're not drinking bottled water, and they're also not drinking tap water. And I don't know what they're doing because we did not probe that in these interviews, but I can tell you from other work we do in public health, there are a lot of people out there in our society that drink only soda or drink only sweet tea or things like that. So there are clearly other bottled beverages besides water that are being consumed in these homes where they're not drinking the tap water. That's something to know, of course. And then, the drinking of the tap water is actually highest in Northern Virginia. Everywhere else, it's in the 70s. And interestingly, the rural areas of the state have some of the lowest levels of drinking tap water. And I've seen this before in agricultural areas and other areas where people actually worry quite a bit about their groundwater and don't want to drink out of their well. And so we do have quite a bit of that occurring in Virginia, in addition to people that may have concerns about public water supplies. What about frequency of drinking bottled water compared to, well, this is not compared, this is not a trend line yet, I'm sorry. This is just often, sometimes, seldom, never. So 40%, 39% of our people said they often drink it and 30% sometimes. So that's almost 3/4 are drinking bottled water often sometimes. That's a lot of bottled water, and the trend line is increasing. So 38% compared to a few years ago are drinking more, 19% are drinking less. So in terms of a trend, there's a 2-to-1 increase over a decrease, if that makes sense. The kind of the weight here is on the increase side. So there's a lot of bottled water drinking, and it's increasing. And it's largely driven by that concern that people have about their tap water supply, but it's probably driven by other things too, like convenience and such. But nonetheless, a big concern about our tap water. All right, so I want to talk about 2 levels of action. We'll start with individual action, which some people call behavior change. And then we'll go to collective action, which we can consider public policy making. So let's just look at those 2 things. First, on the individual side, we wanted to just test willingness, very likely, somewhat likely, not likely to do these 5 things. So use a refillable water bottle or drink filtered tap water instead of buying bottled water. So good willingness, 52% said they're very likely to do that. Use reusable bags instead of single use, 51%. So those two are quite high in terms of people who are poised and maybe willing, and with a little nudge or something, an incentive or a reminder or whatever we need to give them, could be moved into a different category of behavior. Pick up litter and stop using plastic straws. As you can see, that's a jump down in terms of willingness, not quite as ready as a couple of these things up here. A little bit harder, to get people to do these two things, but some good willingness. And, the straw campaign is out there and has been busy and active, and it's making a lot of headway. There's still some more work to do. And then the idea of stop using all single-use plastic items for a month. 28%, very likely. I'm surprised by that. I think that it would probably not really be that high if we had such a campaign. But anyway, you can see that's a harder step for people than some of these other things. Okay, let me go to public policy. So we tested several things, and I'm going to fly through these relatively quickly, but if people are interested in specifics, we can dwell on any one of them if you'd like. But let me just kind of give you the big overview. I mean, the big picture is this. Virginians really want a lot of these public policy measures to be passed into law. So here's the first one. Ban single-use plastic grocery and shopping bags and require paper or reusable bags instead. So that's how we framed it. That's not everybody's proposal, but that's how we framed this, just for the sense of understanding where the public is. Huge, 3-to-1 support. 61% favor that, 21% oppose that. There's a little bit of partisanship with this. In other words, Democrats, 3/4 favor it. Republicans only have to, but still, among Republicans, there's a plurality, a plus 18-point plurality. Independents are in between. Not a big surprise, but they're performing in between the two parties in terms of how people feel about this issue. Let's look at a possible 5-cent fee on single-use plastic bags. So statewide, 48% favor it, 32% oppose it. So it's a plurality. It's 1.5 to 1. There is still a pretty good sized partisanship difference, but Democrats are 3-to-1 in favor, and Republicans actually are a plurality opposed. Now, in this case, independents are a plurality, a near majority in favor. So there's some big differences there. It's interesting to me and to us, I think, that a ban, which seems more onerous, there's no choice involved, punitive, whatever, is much more popular than a simple 5-cent fee that you could avoid just by bringing your reusable bag. That's so interesting, isn't it? This is not to say that we shouldn't pursue 5-cent fees, but it is food for thought. And when we asked people about why they thought, in the in-depth interviews, why they thought the number was so much higher for the banning than for the fee, the common response was, if I'm in the grocery store line, I just know that person in front of me is going to be really annoyed by the 5-cent fee. That's going to really bother people, and people will get angry about it and they'll raise a fuss. And it's so interesting. And people didn't describe themselves. We didn't get people admitting that that's how they would feel necessarily. In fact, most people lauded this as a good measure. Several people lived in jurisdictions that we interviewed who had already implemented this and said it works well, or had lived in other states where there were things that, like a bottle bill or something else, or a plastic bag fee if they had lived somewhere else where there was one, who said it was great. And we do see that phenomenon. I've studied DC and Montgomery County. After these bag fees get passed, their popularity increases as people live with them and understand that they're easy to deal with. But preemptively, we have only a plurality in favor. So something to know about this. Banning plastic straws, 47% favor, 28% opposed. So plurality supports it, but a lot lower than the banning of plastic bags, you recall. So there is, again, on straws, we haven't quite gotten there in the same way that I would say we've gotten there on bags in terms of people being ready to embrace this. Some more work. Ban polystyrene containers, big support, 4-to-1, want to see this happen. This crosses party lines. So we have majorities regardless of party affiliation who support the idea of banning polystyrene. And one of our interviewees, Henry, made this comment, so kind of smartly, you know, kind of sassily. This would have been great legislation back in 1990. This is something that not only do I support it, I think that it should be given 2 months or 2 weeks to find alternative, because there's so many alternatives out there. There's so many things that are compostable. There's so many things that are easily recyclable and cheaper for the restaurants. I have no clue why places are still using styrofoam. What do you really think, Henry, right? But he was not alone in the strength of his comment. It's just that he said it in a way that was more quotable maybe than some other people. But there were a number of people who, having heard that the General Assembly extended for 5 more years the transition time, couldn't believe it and thought that that was not something that our General Assembly should be. Bottle deposit bill, big support. Are you surprised by this? You know, 65% in favor, 17% opposed. Of course, the aspect here is that you're going to get it back, you know, when you return the bottles to a store or redemption center. So we've got big support for this. And it's important to point out that Republicans are almost 60% of them in support of this, independent 65. So there aren't big differences like we've had on some of the other issues across party, that this is widely supported. So good to know about bottle deposit. And then what about a 50 cent per cigarette pack litter fee? 64% in favor, 19% opposed. And again, crosses party lines quite significantly. Require less plastic in packaging. So the idea that we want to require manufacturers to use less plastic in product packaging, roundly supported, 76% in favor, 45% strongly in favor, near majority, only 8% opposed. Require manufacturers to help pay for pickup and processing of recycling in local communities, reducing the burden on taxpayers. 84% of Democrats, 58% of Republicans, 78% of independents, 71% overall favor this concept of extended producer responsibility, getting them to help pay for some things. And here's how Michael from Hampton put it. He's a retired military guy who lives in Hampton, and he said it's time for producers to pay because they need to be involved also. You're producing all these things. You need to understand the necessity of making sure things get recycled. And as a taxpayer, I think it's about time we enforce some of these things for these producers so they can start picking up the slack. So for me, when I see companies and organizations making an effort, that encourages me to make an effort also. I love this last part. I just like the fact that he brings in this, you know, they can set an example for the rest of us. We want to see corporate America doing some of these things too. And quite frankly, when they do, it's going to encourage people like me. So his comment, well stated, helps you understand why EPR is drawing such high numbers from people. It seems only fair to a lot of people. Finally, my last hurrah here is just to tell you very briefly about who the public trusts. We tested a lot of actors, and there are others that aren't here on the screen. I just wanted to show you kind of the top tier and look how close they are to each other, number one. Number two, look how strong all of these are. So some of our public sector agencies, DEQ is doing really well with the public. Trusted a lot, 40, trusted some, 39, for a total of almost 80%. So our nonprofits, Nature Conservancy, CBF, they're on the list. VIMS and the Virginia Aquarium. So all of these players have a very positive profile. Part of the reason I show this slide is because I like to remind public sector people who work for agencies like DEQ, where you might feel somewhat unpopular. You know, it's possible that you might think the public doesn't really like us. The truth is that though the public complains about public agencies from time to time, sometimes vociferously, nonetheless, the scientific role and the sort of objective nature of the information that's coming out of these public agencies is very important and trusted by the public. And I think we Shouldn't forget that. And we're doing public outreach to make sure that public agencies that are at the table are out there visibly as part of the coalition or maybe the lead sponsor. That gives added credibility. So we should not hide our public sector light under a bushel. You know, there actually is quite a bit of value in being connected to the state or maybe to an educational institution that people admire or whatever. And certainly these big nonprofits that the public knows have a very good profile.
Thank you for watching this presentation. For more information on the 2022 Public Perception Survey, visit www.longwood.edu/cleanva.